Are you sure you're sitting in the right seat? That seemingly innocent question, spoken by a flight attendant with a cold, piercing stare, made the entire first-class cabin on Flight 927 feel suffocating. Not because of the volume, but because of the chilling doubt cast upon a man simply because of who he was and how he appeared. Ethan Reynolds, a seasoned police chief who had spent his life safeguarding the community, stood there, publicly scrutinized, suspected, as if he had no right to be in a place he had paid for, rightfully earned, and had every reason to occupy. But what Harper Blake, the flight attendant who caused this incident, didn't know was that the man she had just humiliated in front of dozens of passengers was the husband of the CEO of the Airline, the most powerful and uncompromising woman in the industry, Naomi. And what about Naomi? With just a tap on her phone, she turned a personal insult into a systemic cleansing, an unwavering declaration that no one had the right to judge a person based on prejudice. This wasn't just a dispute on an airplane. This was the beginning of a movement where silence was no longer an option, and truth would no longer be hidden behind polite smiles or hollow apologies. And you, the one watching this story, will witness a breathless journey from injustice to justice, from silence to uprising, from disdain to respect. If you believe that every human being deserves to be treated with fairness and dignity, like, share, and subscribe to the channel now, because right after this, you'll follow Ethan and Naomi on a journey. You won't ever forget Ethan Reynolds gently sat down in the first-class seat, exuding an air of calmness and sophistication, even though inside a storm of emotions was brewing. He wore a crisp white shirt neatly tucked into dark gray trousers, and draped over his shoulders was a finely tailored light-colored vest. Next to him, a cloth bag containing his uniform displayed the embroidered words, clearly, Chief of Police, Hudson City. Despite his simple appearance, Ethan had never been one for ostentation. His integrity and charisma were reflected in every calm step he took, every soft-spoken word, and every deep breath in a world that still hastily judged people by their outer appearances. No one on this flight could have predicted the storm that was about to hit. The late afternoon sunlight poured through the wide window, casting long shadows across the cabin. The peaceful atmosphere was abruptly interrupted by a sharp voice. It was Harper Blake, a flight attendant known for her immaculate uniform and cold, strict demeanor. She paused in front of Ethan, her sharp gaze further accentuated by the cold red lipstick she wore. She asked, her tone full of suspicion, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Her voice was like an ice cube thrown into a still pond, reverberating throughout the cabin. For many, it was just a simple question, but it sparked a chain of events full of injustice. Ethan replied in a calm yet firm voice, "Yes, this is my seat. 1C. He handed over his ticket, a small piece of paper, but a testament to the many years of service and dedication he had given. However, Harper's gaze, filled with doubt and prejudice, swept across the numbers and letters as if she were searching for an error in the identity of the man in front of her. "Are you on duty, or are you with someone else?" she asked, implying much more than was spoken. Ethan's brief nod seemed to do nothing to calm her down. On the contrary, it only seemed to irritate her more. For his presence, calm, simple, yet full of composure, challenged the narrow worldview Harper had built for herself. As she walked away toward the galley, each of her steps seemed to carry a sense of frustration, as if she were trying to impose her authority on others. Ethan quietly leaned back in his seat, surrounded by whispers of sympathy and curious, unabashed stares. He took out his phone and quickly sent a message to his wife. Naomi, the woman who had always been a gentle source of encouragement in his life. The message appeared, "Call me when I land. I'm so proud of you, I love you." The words caused the corners of Ethan's mouth to curve into a faint smile, fragile yet warm, amid the cold, judgmental space around him. No one on this flight knew that things were about to escalate beyond a mere case of discrimination. This would mark the beginning of a fierce confrontation between a man dismissed by others and a woman blinded by her misguided beliefs. While Ethan remained composed, Harper's disdain grew more apparent, as if she were trying to protect the sacred space of first class, a place reserved only for those who met the biased standards she had imposed. In the back, another flight attendant, Ela Monroe, young and gentle, quietly observed. She didn't speak, but the sympathetic glance and slight nod as she passed by Ethan said it all. A stark contrast to Harper's coldness. Even so, Isla couldn't dispel the tense atmosphere enveloping the cabin. When Ethan received the glass of water from Harper, delivered in a cold, almost transactional manner without a word of kindness, the space between them seemed to fill with an invisible smoke of unspoken anger. In Ethan's mind, a flood of memories rushed back. Times when he had been underestimated at upscale restaurants in large hotel lobbies and during important meetings. There, people only saw him through the lens of his skin, his appearance, until they realized who he truly was. But here, on a flight in the skies, he couldn't escape. There was no way out. Every scrutinizing glance, every whispered word was like a hidden knife digging deeper into a wound that had never fully healed. And within the vast American sky, the isolation only became more suffocating. Each suspicious glance, each whispered sneer when accumulated, became more than just a personal incident. It was a declaration of war, a battle nurtured by years of quiet endurance. Ethan looked out the window, his eyes tracing the sparkling blue sky dotted with clouds, but his mind drifted back to the murky memories that had followed him throughout his life. Deep within Ethan Reynolds' heart were scars not just from professional challenges, but from a lifetime of being judged by his skin color, a seemingly shallow trait, yet used as an invisible sharp blade by people like Harper Blake. From the back of the cabin, whispers suddenly grew louder. A young passenger named Omar, his eyes filled with sadness, mixed with anger, leaned towards his sister Layla and whispered about the unjust treatment Ethan had endured. The innocent voices of the two children echoed like a reflection of collective compassion. In each word was a shared acknowledgement that behind an act of cruelty was a person who had devotedly loved and served the community with unwavering perseverance and sacrifice. The hum of the engines roared, signaling that the plane was climbing higher into a region of sky with less prejudice, and it was at that moment that a turning point in the journey was quietly forming, a climax no one could predict. While Harper still believed she was simply enforcing the rules, she had no idea that her actions had triggered an underground resistance, something that would soon upend the existing order. Ethan carried with him a secret not about his professional achievements but about an unbreakable will forged from a lifetime of fighting against injustice. That will was like a tightly wound spring about to snap, demanding a confrontation that could no longer be delayed. In a quiet moment of reflection, Ethan remembered the steadfast encouragement from his wife, Naomi. Every word she had spoken was a way for him to fight against injustice without ever needing to speak out. He opened his phone. A new message from Naomi had just arrived, simple but deeply haunting. What happened? The gentle question was laced with a quiet determination, a warning of the storm to come. and in each word he typed in response, his resolve became clearer than ever. The humiliation he endured would not be forgotten. Meanwhile, in the galley, Harper stood motionless as if caught at a crossroads. Her young colleague, Isla Monroe, still watching everything with a contemplative gaze, gently spoke up. "Have you double-checked the system? Could it be that your judgment today was a little biased?" Her voice wasn't accusatory, but the wisdom of someone who had seen what others chose to ignore. However, Harper simply shrugged her voice, cold full of the smugness of someone used to unconditional respect. The tension between them was a microcosm of the larger societal divides, deeply ingrained prejudices that persist in every environment, even in places that seem the most pristine. The plane continued to glide smoothly through the highest altitudes hidden among the white clouds, but the atmosphere in the cabin had grown heavy as though it were on the cusp of a storm. Ethan, who had silently observed injustice before, now carried within him the flame of righteous anger, a flame that was slowly kindling into the determination to respond. It wasn't a burst of anger, but a smoldering resolve nurtured from years of silent suffering without speaking out. What had begun as a simple flight between two cities had now become a stage for justice. Every look, every gesture could be the spark, and as the dim lights faded and the engine's hum turned into a soft lullaby for the indifferent, for Ethan it was a call to an irreversible silent battle. This journey would not end like a typical flight. It would become a legend of resilience and honor, something that would make even those hearts accustomed to indifference reconsider the very definition of fairness. When the plane's wheels touched down on the runway, no one in the cabin could forget what had happened, a moment that reshaped an entire system. The look in Ethan's eyes didn't need words to declare this was the last time he would remain silent in the face of injustice. Elsewhere, in a sunlit office with expansive windows, Naomi, now the head of the global airline Sky Nova Air, stood still before the window, her gaze growing cold as she read the message she had just received. On the screen was the final message from Ethan, recounting the insulting behavior of the flight attendant. The situation was far more serious, because the person in question was Harper Blake, a senior member Naomi had once trusted. She didn't waste any time reacting. Walking straight to her personal assistant's desk, Naomi gave her command, her voice cold but clear. "Connect me immediately with the captain of that flight, and bring the flight supervisor onto the coordination system right now." She had built this empire from scratch, and today she would not let anyone break her promise of absolute respect on every flight that bore her name. On the airplane, Harper Blake slowly walked past each row of seats, her rigid gait and eyes constantly scanning as if avoiding something. Every step now felt heavier than ever as the disapproving gazes of passengers became more and more apparent. There was no longer any way to avoid the truth that had been exposed. Ethan Reynolds, the man she had once doubted and humiliated in front of so many eyes, was now sitting quietly like a mirror reflecting her own failure. The whispers between the rows, especially from Zane, a regular first-class passenger, made Harper even more uneasy. He leaned toward the person next to him and softly remarked that he had witnessed the entire incident, and felt deeply disappointed. In the cockpit ahead, another scene was unfolding. A warning appeared on the control screen. Executive override. Captain Dawson's face immediately changed. He understood that only one person in the system had the authority to issue this command. Without delay, Dawson set up a video call with Marcus Hill, the director of flight services. The man sat upright in his chair. his serious expression sending a chill down the spine of anyone in the office. Marcus's steady voice broke the tense silence. "We've just received a complaint from a first-class passenger." The name of the complainant was no stranger. It was Ethan Reynolds, the esteemed police chief of Hudson City, and notably, the husband of Naomi, the CEO of Sky Nova. Ere that declaration felt like a shock wave rippling through the cabin. Captain Dawson immediately requested that Harper come to the cockpit. The announcement echoed through the internal intercom, freezing the atmosphere. All the passengers exchanged looks, a mix of surprise and curiosity. Harper, now trembling, set the service tray aside. Her heartbeat raced, the sound of the engines seemed to fade as she took each step toward the cockpit, fully aware that every pair of eyes was now watching her. No longer with curiosity, but with judgment. In his seat, Ethan remained silent, his face a mask of calm. He flipped through a magazine, but the words no longer held any meaning. Inside, a turbulent storm was quietly building. He had endured a lifetime of contemptuous looks, snide remarks. But today, with everyone witnessing it, and with each heavy step Harper took toward the cockpit, the pain he had long suppressed resurfaced, impossible to hide. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was as heavy as lead. Captain Dawson stared at Harper without blinking, then conveyed Marcus Hill's message. "You will return to the passenger cabin. You will publicly apologize to Mr. Ethan Reynolds. Afterward, you will escort him back to his seat and ensure all first-class services are immediately restored." Each word struck the silence like hammer blows. Harper's face turned pale. Now there was no place for her to avoid responsibility. With a trembling voice, she stepped up to Ethan. "Reynolds, I apologize for how I treated you earlier," she whispered. "I made a wrong assumption due to incomplete information, and I realize that was wrong. I made you feel ashamed in front of everyone, and I truly regret it." But her apology fell into the void, dissolving into the thick air of tension. Ethan looked up, his gaze calm yet profound, his voice deep and steady as he spoke. "I've endured worse contempt than this, but this public humiliation, I never thought I'd have to face it." He paused, then continued. "Sorry isn't enough. What matters is admitting and correcting the mistake." Each word, each sentence of his seemed to touch the conscience of everyone witnessing it. A woman in the nearby row turned her head, listening intently to every word. A man slowly lowered his newspaper. Everyone was silent, but in that silence was a wordless demand. Justice must be served. After the apology ended, Harper hesitated, then quietly turned to leave. She didn't return to the service cabin immediately. Instead, she entered the restroom, closed the door behind her, and leaned her forehead against the cold mirror. Her hands trembled, her gaze cast downward. No longer was she the one in charge, but someone who had just lost all credibility in an instant. Outside, in the vast cabin, Ethan turned his gaze toward the window. The sky ahead was covered with a blanket of fluffy white clouds, but in his heart were dark clouds yet to dissipate. The loneliness of a person who has always had to defend his dignity, even in silence. Though Ethan Reynolds' face remained calm inside him, was a smoldering storm of sorrow mixed with unyielding determination. Each stolen glance from the passengers around him, each whisper of sympathy, or even the confused stares, felt like adding fuel to the fire of injustice that had quietly burned throughout his life. He understood all too well. In a world quick to judge based on outward appearance but slow to offer respect, the wounds inflicted by prejudice were deeper than any insult. Yet today, this flight had transcended the boundaries of a mere journey. For many, it was a moment of awakening. A wordless accusation against a system that had long relied on appearance to define worth. Ethan's steadfast silence was not only a symbol of his self-respect, it was a silent pledge that no injustice would go unnoticed again. Amidst the narrow aisles, hushed conversations, and sympathetic glances, all eyes were on him. Meanwhile, Captain Dawson quietly resumed his controls, his expression reflecting the unease of one who understood that even a brief moment of negligence could spark a storm in society. The plane continued to glide smoothly across the sky, but on the ground, Naomi, Ethan's wife, was quietly orchestrating a turning point. Her decisive actions not only shook Skynova Air's operational system, but also resonated in the minds of those who believed that a person's dignity was not something to be bargained with. From what had been a routine flight between two cities, this journey had become a symbol of resistance against the insidious yet toxic prejudices. For Ethan, each passing minute added fuel to his resolve. The humiliation he had endured was the spark for a larger fight for justice, a fight greater than himself. This battle would not only need forgiveness, but also courageous steps against those who belittled the true value of humanity. In the restroom, Harper Blake quietly emerged. Her face bore the marks of exhaustion and regret. The atmosphere in the cabin had now shifted, no longer the usual indifference but a collective awakening. The silent sympathy of the passengers, the intervention of the management team, and Ethan's heavy gaze all merged together to create a moment of catharsis, a moment that called for responsibility and the return of justice with dignity. As the plane continued to soar through the vast American sky at 35,000 feet, everyone aboard seemed to be witnessing a play without a lead actor. For all were witnesses to the silent yet fierce restoration of dignity that had been trampled Ethan Reynolds, the man who once flew under the banner of the airline his talented wife had built, had now become a living symbol of perseverance and silent resistance. On Skynova Flight 811, the atmosphere was heavy, like an invisible rope tightening around each row of seats. Ethan's phone buzzed again, a message from Naomi. The words were brief and decisive. "I've taken care of everything on the ground." He quickly typed a short reply. "Has she apologized?" Ethan's expression remained almost unchanged, but his eyes softened slightly. He knew Naomi's intervention had never been just for him, but for everyone who had been made to feel like an outsider in the place they deserved to belong. He slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket and took a deep breath. Every small action on this flight now carried a different meaning. He was no longer the one silently enduring a shameful situation. He had become the quiet symbol of dignity amidst a public stain, a stain caused by none other than Harper Blake, who had once worn the uniform of the airline. Now, Harper avoided the row where Ethan sat as though it were a forbidden zone. She busied herself cleaning trays that had already been spotless, rearranging napkins that hadn't even been touched, as if clinging to the remnants of control. But every time she passed by him, her steps slowed as if afraid to meet the gaze of the man she had once unjustly doubted. The atmosphere had turned into a suffocating silence. No one seemed to dare breathe too loudly. Some took out their phones pretending to scroll through them. Others simply sat in silence, their gazes distant, but their minds replaying the moments that had just unfolded. In seat 2A, Zane leaned over and whispered to the person next to him, "Did you see how she walked back from the cockpit, like she just had her mask ripped off?" The person next to him nodded slightly, a silent agreement that today's events could not be denied, nor could they be forgotten. In the service cabin, Isla Monroe, the young flight attendant with a compassionate gaze, carefully lifted a sparkling glass of mineral water. Each bubble seemed to react to the thick air outside. She moved forward gently, placing the glass on the table in front of Ethan, and speaking in a voice as soft as the breeze. "Your mineral water, courtesy of the airline." A small gesture, but one that carried an unspoken apology, a bow of sincere empathy between those who still held onto their compassion. Ethan Reynolds smiled gently, nodding slightly at Isla Monroe as a silent thank you. In his eyes, it wasn't just recognition of her as a colleague, but as a true ally, someone who had seen the injustice among the crowd. As the flight continued, Ethan's mind drifted to forgotten memories where his honor had once been disregarded. Painful experiences flooded back like the hotel manager who had made him wait as if he were invisible, or the director who praised his speech only to immediately mock his background. All of it rushed back. Although those memories were painful, they no longer burned him with anger. Instead, they subtly fueled a deep resolve that such events would never be buried in silence again. Not today. Today, every eye on this flight was a witness. What had begun as a simple incident between a passenger and a flight attendant had now become a symbol, and now a keen passenger named Eamon had posted the entire incident on social media, accompanied by a message: a respected man was humiliated in first class just because of the prejudice in a single look. In the back service cabin, each step Harper Blake took seemed weighed down by the consequences of what was to come. Isla, in a soft but firm tone, reiterated the warning. "Did you think it was over?" Harper snapped back her voice, faltering under the tension. "Do you think he won't speak up?" Isla, leaning against the coffee machine, replied slowly, "You're lucky he didn't say more. Many others wouldn't have been so patient." That brief exchange, though simple, uncovered the whole truth. Bias had guided Harper's actions, leading to the collapse of both her credibility and her professional ethics. When someone asked her whether her actions were racially discriminatory, her silence was the clearest answer, more telling than any defense she could offer. Isla's calm yet firm advice: "You should prepare your explanation when we land, because this won't end with just an apology." Meanwhile, in seat 2C, Ethan continued observing everything around him with his usual calm. His phone buzzed again, a message from Naomi. "The plane will land in 20 minutes. Don't say anything else. I'll handle the rest." He smiled faintly, fully aware of the resolve behind those few words. Ethan never saw his role as merely enduring. He existed as a living symbol of resilience. The silence after the message was no longer submission. It was a promise of a change that was about to unfold. The entire cabin seemed to be enveloped in an unusually heavy silence. Passengers who had been lost in their own thoughts subtly adjusted their postures, as if they could sense something about to happen. Captain Dawson made an announcement over the intercom that the plane would begin descending in 45 minutes, and that ground security had been mobilized to ensure Mr. Reynolds was received with the utmost respect. The whole cabin seemed to hold its breath. The usual hustle and bustle before landing had disappeared, replaced by a dense silence. As every passenger quietly reflected, Ethan sat upright, his hands clasped together, not from worry, but from the confidence of someone accustomed to walking through adversity with grace. He had endured many silent battles, and in each scar was a lesson learned over a lifetime. But this time, the humiliation caused by Harper would not be forgotten, like all the others. It would become the catalyst for a powerful response, not only for him, but for all those who had been underestimated. Amidst the tension, a well-dressed passenger named Nasser, a frequent business traveler, leaned toward Ethan, his voice hesitant. "Sir, I witnessed what happened earlier. It was truly an unfortunate event." Ethan looked at him calmly, replying, "Do you think it was a mistake from the start, or only after you found out who I am?" The question lingered, reverberating like a long chime. Nasser froze his face, flushing. He understood. He was part of the system that allowed such things to happen without questioning them. The awkwardness of that moment was like a silent confession to all the passengers. This was no longer an isolated incident. This was an undeniable accusation, and it demanded more than a weak apology. As the plane continued its descent, Yaman's post spread rapidly. Everyone in the cabin began to realize this story had gone beyond the scope of a mere flight. An internal message from the coordination department was sent. Upon landing security, and a company representative would be waiting at the airplane door to welcome Mr. Reynolds, a stark contrast to how he had been treated before. Harper Blake's fate seemed to have been sealed. She would have to remain on the plane after all the passengers disembarked, escorted directly to the operations office, where a high-level disciplinary review awaited. Her heavy footsteps and eyes filled with worry already told the tale of a bitter lesson she would never forget. The final moments before landing were an odd mix of anticipation and a deep, reflective stillness. Ethan Reynolds remained seated calm and composed, listening to the whispered conversations around him like the ringing of warning bells. Though his mind drifted to old memories, his heart was set on one undeniable truth. Justice could not be hidden behind polite apologies or closed-door meetings. No justice would be executed with clarity, decisiveness, and unmistakable force. When the seatbelt sign came on, passengers began fastening their seatbelts, not in the usual manner of preparing for landing, but as though waiting for a solemn ritual. What had once been an ordinary flight had now become a turning point, where silence was broken by a promise of retribution. Ethan was no longer just the one who had been offended. He was now a living symbol of resilience, proof that dignity did not need to be shouted. It only needed to be protected. And today, the one standing up to protect him was Naomi, his sharp and steadfast wife, the woman who could make an entire airline bow its head in respect. As he sat quietly in the dim light of first class, his phone buzzed softly in his pocket. "Another message from Naomi Security will meet the plane. Don't say anything until I arrive." Watch their eyes. Ethan smiled faintly and closed his phone. He knew the storm of justice was about to hit, like rain washing away the layers of prejudice and injustice. Outside the window, the layers of clouds parted, revealing the glittering city lights below, like a metaphor for the truth slowly coming to light. In the galley, Harper gripped the counter tightly, her hands slick with cold sweat, her eyes darting nervously toward Ethan's seat. She couldn't avoid the gaze of the other passengers' eyes growing more intense questioning. A seemingly normal action checking tickets had transformed into a public humiliation of a man of great dignity, not because of any fault of his own, but because of the deep-rooted prejudice within her. She repeated to herself that she was just following the procedure, but the gazes from the passengers were like unspoken verdicts that her choice to question him was neither objective nor necessary. As tension rose, Isla Monroe quietly approached Harper, saying nothing. But that silence spoke volumes, a confrontation without words. But Clear Harper's actions were not just wrong, they were fundamentally unjust. While Adla quietly checked the landing preparations, Harper asked, her voice trembling almost to herself, "Do you really think they will come?" Adla's slight nod was the answer. No words were needed. She confirmed what everyone already knew. Naomi was waiting at the plane door. Her reputation didn't precede her through threats, but through authority built on integrity and unshakable resolve. Naomi was the woman who had built Sky Nova Air from scratch, and any decision she made was the final one. Captain Dawson's voice came through the intercom. "We will land at the private gate. Security will assist passengers in disembarking." The announcement spread like wildfire through the cabin. Passengers in first class grew restless, whispering among themselves. Everyone knew the resolution of this incident would not come easily. Ethan watched everything with the steady gaze of someone who had lived through both glory and bitterness. He had once been looked down upon, once had his abilities doubted not because of his achievements, but because of his appearance. But today he was no longer alone. Every eye on him now silently acknowledged that he deserved respect. As the plane rolled to the private gate, the scene outside grew as tense as a drawn bowstring. A glossy black SUV waited, its windows tinted dark, with two security personnel standing rigidly beside the plane's stairs. And right in the middle of the scene, a woman in a dark green trench coat. Her scarf, lightly blowing in the wind, stood firmly, her gaze fixed intently on the plane. That woman was none other than Naomi, a woman whose very name could halt an entire industry. Captain Dawson stepped out of the cockpit and slowly made his way to Ethan Reynolds' seat. His voice was calm but firm. "Please remain in your seat until security arrives to escort you." Ethan nodded, his face unmoved, as though he understood clearly that he was no longer just a victim of an incident, but part of something larger, a collective awakening. And then all eyes in the cabin turned to the airplane door where Naomi stepped onto the plane. Without a smile or a word, her calm, commanding gaze swept through the cabin like a cold wind, silencing every whispered conversation. When her eyes met Ethan's, she gave him a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement that the injustice had been recognized and would be rectified. Her gaze then shifted to Harper Blake. Time seemed to stop. Harper stood frozen, all her previous attempts at defense now just shallow gasps. Naomi's gaze neither angry nor harsh, but sharp as a blade, cut through any remaining illusions of her power. With steady steps, Naomi moved through the cabin, standing in the very space where the guilt had just been exposed. Without the need for a microphone, her voice still carried clear to every person I am. Naomi, the CEO of Sky Nova Air. The entire cabin fell into absolute silence. A few hours ago, my husband, Police Chief Ethan Reynolds, was publicly questioned, not because of a system error, but simply because someone looked at his appearance and decided he didn't deserve to sit in first class. Her voice was unwavering, not loud, but carrying the weight of a verdict. Our company has clear policies, and nowhere in them is there room for discrimination. We do not tolerate prejudice in any form. The air grew thick. Each of her words cut through the invisible mask that had covered generations, this mask called standard procedure. She then turned to face Harper. The flight attendant's face was now pale, her lips trembling. "You humiliated a man who has spent his life protecting lives, including the lives of people like you. And worse, you didn't properly check the ticket. Didn't follow protocol and let your bias lead the way." Harper tried to speak, but Naomi raised her hand. a gesture that was silent but full of power. No further excuses were needed. The entire cabin seemed to breathe in unison. No one needed to say a word. Every eye was remembering the moment justice had been restored. 2 security personnel entered without a sound, walking directly to Harper. "You will come with us." There was nothing more to say. Harper walked away like a shadow, her face hard with the shame she could not escape passengers around her, whispered their gazes wavering between sympathy and acknowledgement of the right thing that had just happened. Once Harper had been escorted away, Naomi turned back to Ethan, her gaze softening, her hand gently placed on her husband's shoulder. "The board has scheduled an investigation. She's suspended effective immediately." Ethan smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting gratitude not only for the woman beside him, but also for the truth that had been brought to light amidst the clouds. At that moment, Isla Monroe approached. She was the only one who had acted correctly throughout the ordeal. Naomi looked at her with warm eyes. "Today, you weren't the head of the flight, but you've shown leadership beyond expectation." She continued, her voice both gentle and firm. "When we return to headquarters, I need to meet with you. I require a detailed report of everything you witnessed." Isla was taken aback by the recognition from the CEO, but she nodded, her eyes filled with unspoken emotion. The final scene in the cabin was one of closure, but not an end. It was the beginning of justice. As the security team guided the passengers and crew off the plane, Captain Dawson's voice came through the cabin. "Today's journey may be over, but I believe we all will remember what just happened." Ethan, now standing tall, his hand gently holding his wife's, no longer carrying the weight of the injustices he had endured. Now he had witnesses, and they stood with him. The silence that once surrounded them had transformed into a silent acknowledgement, respect. As they stepped off the plane into the cool evening air, they saw the black SUV waiting at the private gate. The car was unassuming, but its presence was a statement the next journey would be one of change. And in Naomi's mind, her earlier words to Isla echoed once again. "When we're at the office, I need the full report. Every detail matters." Ethan, now free from the stifling atmosphere of the cabin, looked back one final time as if bidding farewell to the place where he had once been humiliated, and now where it had witnessed the collapse of an entire system under the light of truth. As Ethan Reynolds and his wife walked toward the waiting black SUV, the whispers that had once filled the cabin of the plane now transformed into nods of silent respect. The passengers who had once stood in silence in the face of prejudice now silently promised one another this would not be forgotten. That flight, Sky Nova 811, was no longer just the scene of an offense. It had become a symbol, an undeniable declaration that human dignity must always be protected. Ethan, who had quietly endured countless battles, now stood as a beacon of resilience, bolstered by a wife who was not just a life partner but a leader of an entire Sky Naomi. When the car door closed behind them and the evening breeze quietly surrounded them, it was clear. This journey would leave behind a legacy of transparency, unwavering resolve, and a determination to fight against injustice. Inside the car, the soft lighting contrasted sharply with the tension that had just passed. Naomi sat beside her husband, her face no longer stern but filled with deep contemplation and determination. She thought she could do this in front of a crowd, and no one would react. Naomi said, her voice calm but filled with disappointment. Ethan didn't need to say much. One glance was enough for Naomi to understand this wasn't just an insult, but a feeling of being stripped of his rightful place. He replied. She wasn't just confident, she was overconfident, believing no one would dare stand up against her actions. Naomi nodded, her gaze sharpening. That's something I will never accept. Not in this company. Not under my name. Without hesitation, she opened her bag, pulled out a tablet, and quickly accessed a marked file. Plan for overhaul of crew behavior. Urgent. Tomorrow. I'll meet with the board of directors. She declared every first-class service procedure will be reevaluated. I'll implement mandatory anti-bias training, create an anonymous reporting system for both passengers and staff, and starting next week, I'll personally select 5 head flight attendants to form a new internal review council. Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised by her swift decisiveness. You're doing all this because of what happened today. Naomi looked at him, her eyes unwavering. Not just because of today, but because today everyone saw it and no one spoke up. It's that silence that is the true enemy. Ethan sighed softly. It was never just about me, was it? Naomi shook her head, affirming firmly. No, it was never just about one person. It's about everyone who's ever been looked down upon simply because they don't fit someone else's expectations. As the SUV slowly made its way through the private gate out of the airport on the plane, Harper Blake sat quietly in the back row, her eyes red and swollen, her voice barely a whisper as she answered the questions from 2 senior internal evaluators. She understood there was no place left to hide. One of the men gently closed the file and said, "We'll contact you within 24 hours. For now, you're suspended. You're not to wear the uniform or work any flights until further notice." There were no more excuses. No more resistance. Just the heavy silence of an unspoken sentence. Harper understood what had happened was not a workplace accident. It was a choice, and she would have to live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of her life. What had happened on Sky Nova 811 was not a mistake. It was a choice. A choice that Harper Blake would have to carry as an indelible mark for the rest of her life. Outside, the world continued to spin the cars on the street speeding under the yellow streetlights. Inside the sleek black SUV, Ethan Reynolds leaned his head out the window, letting the cool evening breeze gently brush his face. The soft leather seats inside the car offered a rare sense of peace. A peace not because the pain had ended, but because justice had begun to speak. Ethan's body gradually relaxed, but in his mind every glance of contempt, every dismissive word still played like a film in rewind. Harper's question, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" still rang out sharp and cold, carrying the weight of a long-standing prejudice. Beside him, Naomi continued working on her tablet, her fingers typing quickly, but with determination. She didn't look at her husband, but quietly spoke. This isn't about a burst of anger. This is about a policy that needs to be enforced. How do we ensure this doesn't happen again? Ethan asked, his voice soft. Have you started writing the new regulations already? Naomi answered without hesitation. It's done. It's going into effect on Friday. All flight attendants on every flight will undergo rigorous retraining. No more half-hearted training, no more empty apologies. She paused, her eyes softening a little. You're not the only reason I'm doing this. I'm doing it because if it could happen to someone like you, someone with experience, composure, and dignity, it could happen to anyone, and not everyone has a powerful wife waiting at the gate. The car silently turned into the building's underground parking garage where the security team was waiting. When the door opened, Ethan stepped out first, stretching his back as if shaking off the weight of the long day, Naomi followed her tablet still clutched tightly in her hand, her gaze unwavering. In the elevator, no one spoke. Their modern, minimalist apartment greeted them with warm light, spilling from floor-to-ceiling windows where the lights of Hudson City twinkled like thousands of urban stars. Ethan hung up his coat and walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. He took a sip, then paused thoughtfully. I wonder if she'll ever understand what she did today. Naomi stood beside him, her voice gentle but firm. Maybe not. But that moment, it will stay with her forever, like a reminder that power can crumble quickly when challenged at the right moment. Ethan nodded, exhaling. It's just the beginning, but it's a necessary one. Silence filled the room again. Not the heavy silence of oppression, but the quiet of those who understood the injustices that had weighed them down for years. Then Naomi's phone buzzed. A notification. News of the Sky Nova 811 flight incident had leaked social media, was already circulating snippets, screenshots, and accounts from passengers. She looked at the screen for a few seconds, then locked the phone, her voice calm but resolute. I don't need the world to be outraged. I just need the policies to be changed. The truth will always triumph over prejudice. She sat down at the desk, opened her notes, and began drafting her speech for the board meeting. Tomorrow's meeting would not just be about handling Harper. It would be a declaration of corporate culture reform. The next morning, beneath the cold gray skies of Hudson City, Naomi entered the headquarters of Sky Nova Air. Dressed in a dark gray trench coat and a neat blouse, her hair tied up. She didn't need to say much. Just the way she walked into the room made it silent. Without wasting any time, she placed a leather case on the table, opened it, and spoke clearly. This is not a meeting. This is a correction. She paused, her gaze sweeping across each person in the room. What happened yesterday was not just a personal offense. It's the result of unchecked power and a flawed training system. No one interrupted. We've always prided ourselves on professionalism and respect. But those words mean nothing if power is used to humiliate customers based on their appearance. Naomi declared a comprehensive investigation, not only into the recent incident but also into any complaints over the last 18 months. One board member, Iran, spoke up. Do we need to issue a press release? Naomi looked him straight in the eye. Our actions will speak for us. Change must be reflected in procedures and training and in absolute respect. There was no more debate. The room fell silent, as if everyone realized the time for turning a blind eye had ended. Back at their apartment, Ethan stood by the window, the lights of Hudson City still twinkling in the distance. His face was expressionless, but inside there was a newfound peace, the kind that came after years of silence now finally broken. The injustice that Ethan Reynolds had endured had finally been seen and confronted, not through angry shouts, but through the resolute actions of the woman who truly understood and loved him. As the couple prepared for the new day, the memories of Sky Nova 811 remained vivid, not just as a reminder of the pain, but as a commitment to change quiet yet irreversible. That fateful flight didn't just change one person's life, it shook the entire culture of an airline as the black SUV silently left the airport and glided into the heart of Hudson City, the city lights reflected on the car's windows. Meanwhile, Naomi stood by the side of the road for a moment longer, her gaze never leaving the airplane where Harper Blake still sat quiet alone, facing the consequences. At the rear of the plane, two senior management executives were conducting an internal investigation. Harper had been instructed to remain until the review process was complete. But, in Naomi's heart, the verdict had been clear long ago. She will never wear that uniform again." The words, spoken softly like a breeze in the car, carried an unshakable weight. Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaling for the first time since the plane took off. They sat in silence, no more words needed. Everything had been said with their eyes, with decisive actions and quiet strength. After a moment, Naomi spoke, her tone steady. "When I took over this airline, I promised that every passenger stepping onto our plane would be treated with respect, and today I've seen that promise betrayed." Ethan smiled faintly, but the sadness still lingered in his eyes. "That cold question, those looks that seem to tear apart my dignity, will haunt me for a long time." Naomi's voice grew sharper. "I've started the entire overhaul program. Tomorrow, the board meeting will take place. Every head flight attendant will undergo retraining, not by outside experts, but by those who've been unfairly judged based on appearance." She continued, "From today, we'll also have an anonymous reporting system. Any employee, regardless of rank, can send a report directly to my office if they witness any form of discrimination. Flight attendants with 3 or more incidents will be reviewed immediately. We cannot let prejudice persist." Ethan nodded. "Listening to every word, you've changed so much since taking charge. But you don't use power to intimidate. You use it to protect." Naomi looked directly at him, her eyes alight with determination. "That's why this cannot continue. Not just because of you, but because of everyone who has ever been made to feel smaller, just because of their appearance." The car turned away from the private gate, leaving the airport and the painful memories behind. On the plane, Harper sat facing the evaluation panel. Her eyes were red, her voice hoarse, each attempt to justify herself dismissed by the undeniable truth. One of the executives gently closed the file and spoke in a calm but decisive tone. "We will respond within 24 hours. For now, you are suspended. You're not allowed to wear the uniform or board any flights until further notice." There was no resistance, only the heavy silence of acceptance that she had chosen the wrong path and would have to face the consequences. As the evening descended over Hudson City, Ethan had a scheduled talk at the city's police academy. A topic, leadership in adversity and maintaining integrity when doubted, the room was completely silent. The eyes of the cadets fixed on the man speaking, not just the police chief, but a living testament to the fact that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs to stand firm and unyielding. By the end of the day, the incident had spread throughout the airline's internal system. An urgent notification was sent to all employees from flight attendants to ground staff. All flight crews must participate in retraining on passenger respect policies. This is mandatory. No one could turn a blind eye anymore. A new chapter had begun. What had happened on Sky Nova 8111 was not an accident. It was a choice that Harper Blake would carry with her as an indelible mark for the rest of her life. Outside, the world continued to turn the cars on the street speeding under the golden streetlights. Inside the sleek black SUV, Ethan Reynolds leaned his head out the window, feeling the cool night breeze gently brush his face. The soft leather seats inside the car offered a rare sense of peace, not because the pain had ended, but because justice had begun to speak. Ethan's body relaxed, but in his mind, every look of contempt, every dismissive remark still played like a film in rewind. Harper's question, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" still echoed sharp and cold, carrying the weight of a long-standing prejudice. Beside him, Naomi continued working on her tablet, her fingers typing quickly but with certainty. She didn't look at her husband, but quietly spoke. "This isn't a burst of anger. This is a policy that needs to be enforced. How do we make sure this never happens again?" Ethan asked softly. "Have you started writing the new regulations?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "It's done. It goes into effect on Friday. All flight attendants on every flight will undergo rigorous retraining. No more half-hearted training, no more empty apologies." She paused, her eyes softening slightly. "You're not the only reason I'm doing this. I'm doing it because if it could happen to someone like you, someone with experience, composure, and dignity, it could happen to anyone. And not everyone has a powerful wife waiting at the gate." The car silently turned into the building's underground parking garage where the security team was waiting. When the door opened, Ethan stepped out first, stretching his back as if shaking off the weight of the long day. Naomi followed, her tablet still clutched tightly in her hand, her gaze unwavering. In the elevator, no one spoke. Their modern, minimalist apartment greeted them with warm light, spilling from floor-to-ceiling windows where the lights of Hudson City twinkled like thousands of urban stars. Ethan hung up his coat and walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. He took a sip, then paused thoughtfully. "I wonder if she'll ever understand what she did today." Naomi stood beside him, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe not. But that moment, it will stay with her forever, like a reminder that power can crumble quickly when challenged at the right moment." Ethan nodded, exhaling. "It's just the beginning, but it's a necessary one." Silence filled the room again. Not the heavy silence of oppression, but the quiet of those who understood the injustices that had weighed them down for years. Then Naomi's phone buzzed. A notification news of the Sky Nova 8111 flight incident had leaked social media, was already circulating snippets, screenshots, and accounts from passengers. She looked at the screen for a few seconds, then locked the phone, her voice calm but resolute. "I don't need the world to be outraged. I just need the policies to be changed. The truth will always triumph over prejudice." She sat down at the desk, opened her notes, and began drafting her speech for the board meeting. Tomorrow's meeting would not just be about handling Harper. It would be a declaration of corporate culture reform. The next morning, beneath the cold gray skies of Hudson City, Naomi entered the headquarters of Sky Nova Air, dressed in a dark gray trench coat and a neat blouse, her hair tied up. She didn't need to say much. Just the way she walked into the room made it silent. Without wasting any time, she placed a leather case on the table, opened it, and spoke clearly. "This is not a meeting. This is a correction." She paused, her gaze sweeping across each person in the room. What happened yesterday was not just a personal offense. It's the result of unchecked power and a flawed training system. No one interrupted. We have always prided ourselves on professionalism and respect. But those words mean nothing if power is used to humiliate customers based on their appearance. Naomi declared a comprehensive investigation not only into the recent incident but also into any complaints over the last 18 months. One board member, Iran, spoke up. "Do we need to issue a press release?" Naomi looked him straight in the eye. "Our actions will speak for us. Change must be reflected in procedures, in training, and in absolute respect." There was no more debate. The room fell silent, as if everyone realized the time for turning a blind eye had ended. Back at their apartment, Ethan stood by the window, the lights of Hudson City still twinkling in the distance. His face was expressionless, but inside there was a newfound peace, the kind that came after years of silence now finally broken. The message sent to the entire airline system was clear and resolute, with no apology. An announcement that what had just happened was not an accident, but a turning point that could not be ignored. In the small meeting rooms at the training center, many employees whispered among themselves. Some tried to justify Harper Blake's actions, claiming she was just following the procedure. The others chose silence because they knew they too had turned a blind eye to repeated injustices. In a small room in the corner of the center, Layla, the only young flight attendant who dared to do the right thing at the crucial moment, was sitting alone, scrolling through a series of messages on her phone. Many longtime colleagues who hadn't reached out before now quietly sent their congratulations. "I admire how you handled that situation. You might get promoted." But no message eased her heart. Each word of encouragement contained a painful truth. Layla had done what many weren't brave enough to do. Stand up when no one else dared. The door to the room opened. Naomi walked in her posture straight each step, radiating determination. Without speaking much, she gently closed the door. Layla immediately stood up tense. "Sit down," Naomi said softly but firmly. Layla obeyed, unable to hide her nervousness. "I've read your report." Naomi began, her gaze never leaving the girl in front of her. "I read it twice, and I admire you. Not just because you were honest, but because you acted immediately. You didn't wait for orders, you didn't hide behind ranks. You saw what was wrong and didn't look away." Layla choked up. After a moment, she could only whisper, "Thank you." Naomi's gaze softened slightly. "I'll be transferring you. Starting next week, you'll become the assistant coordinator for the senior flight crew. You'll work closely with my office for 3 months to oversee the flight crew reform program. I need someone who knows what's right and has the courage to speak up when no one else dares." Layla was stunned, her heart pounding in her chest. Yes," she said, her voice trembling. Naomi nodded slightly. "You helped my husband today. But more importantly, you helped this company remember who we should be. At the same time elsewhere in Hudson City." Ethan Reynolds quietly walked through the parking lot after his lecture at the police academy. As he opened his car door, a message from Naomi appeared. "She's officially fired. Your name will be on the Flight Crew Reform Board." A faint smile appeared on Ethan's face. For the first time, silence no longer shielded those in power. For the first time, a quiet man could be the one to seal the deal. The evening settled gently, and Hudson City began to shine brightly under the lights. Returning to their high-rise apartment with panoramic views of the city, Ethan sat quietly on the sofa, a book opened but unfinished on his lap. Naomi emerged from her office holding her tablet, her face still radiating determination. They stood together, silently, watching the lights outside like untold stories. "You didn't go into the bedroom last night?" Ethan spoke softly. Naomi smiled. "Neither did you." A brief silence followed, then he spoke gently. "I wonder if she'll ever understand what she caused." Naomi sat down beside him, her voice low but sharp. "Maybe not today, but she will never forget the feeling of being led off the plane in front of everyone, and when the whole world is watching, no one will stand up for her anymore." Ethan nodded. This was just the beginning, but it was a necessary beginning. That night, a headline appeared on a major news site: "CEO of Airline acts quickly after discrimination incident employee fired reform program announced." The image showed Naomi speaking at the board meeting, and beside her, Layla, her face proud yet not arrogant. Ethan knew that from that moment on, silence would no longer be complicit. No one, no one would ever be asked again, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" There are people who don't need to shout to be heard. They only need to stand firm in the storm face the injustice head on and let their actions speak louder than any empty excuses. Ethan Reynolds didn't scream when he was humiliated. He didn't react angrily, didn't slam the table, didn't demand power. He simply held his head high, sent a message, and the rest became a cultural revolution in the airline industry, sparked by the love and determination of his partner Naomi. And in that moment, when the entire plane watched as Harper Blake was asked to leave in front of dozens of passengers, they understood that the era of turning a blind eye had ended. No longer would anyone look at a man of color and ask, "Are you sure you belong here?" Because from now on, every flight attendant will be trained not just in skills, but in fairness and compassion. Every passenger will have the opportunity to speak up, and every Ethan out there, whether well known or not, will be protected by the very system that once failed them. Today's story proves that silence is no longer safe, and justice will no longer wait. If you've ever felt looked down upon because of your appearance, skin color, background, or origins, remember that you are not alone. You deserve respect. You deserve to be heard. And if the world has ever tried to make you believe that you don't belong here, answer with the pride in your eyes. I don't need permission to exist. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe that everyone deserves to be seen with fair eyes, like, share, and subscribe to help spread this story further. We will continue to bring you emotional, inspiring stories that make you believe in the good amidst a world full of wounds. Let's protect the dignity of every person with stories, actions, and hearts.